In 1637, a single tulip bulb sold for the price of a house. Merchants mortgaged their homes, sailors sold their ships, chimney sweeps, maids, aristocrats, everyone went insane over flowers. Then the market crashed overnight. Fortunes were wiped out. Desperate investors threw themselves into the canals of Amsterdam. It is the most famous financial bubble in history. There is just one problem. Almost none of it actually happened. The story of tulip mania that you know, the one taught in every economics class, referenced in every book about market bubbles, was invented by one man, 200 years after the events actually took place. Today we uncover the real story of tulip mania. And trust me, the truth is even more fascinating than the myth. To understand tulip mania, you first need to understand Holland in the 1630s. The Dutch were the most powerful trading nation on earth. Amsterdam was the financial capital of the world. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was the first publicly traded company in history and the most valuable corporation that has ever existed. Dutch merchants had more money than they knew what to do with. And into this world of extraordinary wealth arrived something completely alien, the tulip. Brought to Holland from the Ottoman Empire around 1590, tulips were unlike anything Northern Europeans had ever seen. Vivid reds, purples, and yellows, colors that seemed almost impossible for a flower. And the rarest variety of all, the broken tulip, had petals streaked with multiple colors in wild, unpredictable patterns. Nobody knew why some tulips broke into these patterns. Today we know it was caused by a virus, but in 1630s Holland, it seemed like pure magic. And magic, when you're the richest country in the world, is worth a fortune. By 1634, tulip mania had swept through Holland. The most prized bulbs, varieties like Semper Augustus and Viceroy, were selling for extraordinary prices. A single Semper Augustus bulb sold for 6,000 guilders. To put that in perspective, a skilled craftsman in Holland earned about 300 guilders a year. One tulip bulb, 20 years of salary. And here is where the story gets truly fascinating. Nobody was actually buying tulips to grow them. They were buying contracts, promises to deliver a tulip bulb in the spring when it could be dug up from the ground. Holland had accidentally invented the world's first futures market. Merchants were trading promises of tulips, paper contracts, that changed hands dozens of times before a single bulb ever moved. Sound familiar? It should. Because this is exactly how modern financial markets work. The Dutch didn't just have a tulip bubble. They accidentally invented derivatives trading 400 years ago. Then came February 3rd, 1637. At a routine bulb auction in Haarlem, nobody showed up to buy. Not because the tulips were worthless, but because a rumor had spread that the market was cooling. Prices dropped, then dropped further. Within weeks, the tulip futures market had collapsed. The bulbs that had sold for 6,000 guilders were now worth almost nothing. And here's where the famous story says, fortunes were wiped out, merchants were ruined. Desperate investors drowned themselves in the canals of Amsterdam. But historian Anne Goldgar spent years in Dutch archives searching for evidence of this catastrophe. What she found was shocking. She could only identify 37 people who had paid more than 300 guilders for a tulip bulb. No major bankruptcies, no suicides in canals, no economic catastrophe. Because here's the thing that everyone misses. Most of the tulip contracts were never actually paid. The buyers simply refused to honor them. And since tulip trading had happened in informal tavern auctions, not on the official Amsterdam Stock Exchange, there was no legal mechanism to enforce the contracts. The sellers were angry, but they weren't ruined. The Dutch economy, the most powerful in the world, barely noticed. So where did the famous story come from? One man, a Scottish journalist named Charles Mackay. In 1841, 200 years after the actual events, Mackay published a book called Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. In it, he described tulip mania as the greatest financial catastrophe in history. Chimney sweeps gambling their life savings, aristocrats ruined overnight, bodies floating in canals. It was vivid. It was dramatic. It was almost entirely fiction. Mackay had never visited a Dutch archive. He based his account on a handful of satirical pamphlets, written by Dutch Calvinist moralists who wanted to mock what they saw as the greed of merchants. In other words, the most famous account of Tulip Mania was based on propaganda. But Mackay's book became wildly popular. And for 180 years, every economist, every business school professor, every financial journalist repeated his version of events. The myth became history. But here's the twist. Even if the details were exaggerated, the underlying phenomenon was completely real. A market did form around tulip bulbs. Prices did rise to irrational levels. The market did collapse. And the mechanics of what happened in Holland in 1636 and 1637, the futures contracts, the speculation, the sudden loss of confidence, are identical to every financial bubble since. The South Sea bubble of 1720, the railway mania of the 1840s, the dot-com bubble of 2000, the housing crisis of 2008, the crypto bubble of 2021. Every single one followed the same pattern. New asset, excitement, rising prices. Everyone wants in. Prices detach from reality. One moment of doubt. Collapse. Tulip Mania wasn't a story about flowers. It was the first documented proof that human beings, given the right conditions, will convince themselves that anything is worth any price. The story you were told about Tulip Mania was mostly invented by one journalist in 1841. The real story is quieter, but far more disturbing, because it tells us something uncomfortable about human nature. We don't need chimney sweeps throwing themselves in canals to have a bubble. We just need enough people to believe, for long enough, that something is worth more than it actually is. That's the real lesson of Tulip Mania. And it's a lesson that humanity has failed, over and over, for 400 years. If you want more stories like this, subscribe to Empire Unveiled. Next week, the man who single-handedly bankrupted the entire country of France and got away with it.